welcome back to the Palm Court Podcast. Mike Palmer here, joined as always by Megan Citron and Grant Balfour. Welcome back to the podcast, folks.
Thank you. It's nice to see you again. Missed you.
Yeah, it's been a little while, not too long enough. But we're joined, as always, by a delightful guest. Today's delightful guest is Jeb Lund. Jeb, welcome to the Palm Court Pod.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here.
The honor and the pleasure is mutual. And, maybe just to get us started, we always like to hear folks in their own words tell us who they are and how they connect to New College. Can you kick us off with a little of your origin story?
So I transferred in fall of 97. I was a California boy. I moved to Northwest Florida for high school, and I was actually expecting to go to school out of state, but financial issues intervened. And I did a couple years of community college on a forensic scholarship and didn't know what to do next. And my mom came in my room in, I think, like February or March and said, "Get out."
Yeah.
She was just like, "You're wasting away here. Just get out."
Just to clarify, forensics, that's not like CSI forensics. It's like debate, right?
Yeah, it's so I wound up, I performed mainly dramatic interp, but I also did parliamentary debate, extemporaneous speaking, after dinner speaking.
Gift of the gab stuff.
I helped write Lincoln Douglas debate cases. I did not do CETA/policy debate, which is the real, when you think of like who are the most bad faith politicians and litigators, sort of Ted Cruz types, those are the people who excelled at CETA and policy debate, because it's pretty much the argument you want to make is like increase in immigration? No, nuke war. Right. And you go immediately to your most recent citation for how more Guatemalans cause nuclear. And
the Sith Lords of forensics.
But yeah, I had a friend who was I feel really bad actually about this. Is like one of the, well, to be honest, like when I have memories of New College, usually my first response is like, I really hope I have an opportunity to apologize to that person. But my first sort of New College thing is I feel bad and I apologize to a friend of mine who's since gone on to be a much better historian and scholar than I was ever going to approach being. But I had a buddy who really wanted to go, and I wound up applying and got in, and she didn't. Yeah, so we had about a month where we weren't simpatico.
But mom shouted at you on the couch, and that behooved you to do something.
Yeah, and I also think that New College was one of the few schools in the state of Florida whose application deadline hadn't already elapsed.
That might explain the preponderance of procrastinators.
Right. It wasn't like I had not planned well, and I think my academic career sort of reflected that inauspicious start. Back at the time, Shell Station still sold bottles of ephedra, and that definitely played a role in writing papers.
And then you've gone on since graduating, or did you graduate? What was your actual history through New College? What happened there?
So I started out, I wanted to do European history with Dr. Demi, and then did not really see eye to eye with him as my advisor, and switched to Dr. Donaghy and was writing a thesis. That was one of those things where it was planned I was going to do, the 110 page New College thesis, then that was going to become a great 30-page article and master's thesis, and then that could get turned into a book because it was an area of scholarship that did not have more than like a couple of really what you would think of as like biased sources, people who were involved in the period of history that they were writing on, and in fact were in some cases like officially sanctioned by the government to write on it. So it was just going to punch my ticket. And instead, I was staying in Goldstein over the summer. I was working as the New College archivist. So I got free room in Dortstein, and our room flooded, and it pumped 880 gallons of water into my dorm room and pulped my notes, which I'd taken handwritten on these little spiral bound notebooks. So I was going through book by book and writing down page numbers, and I came back to my room. My roommate found me off campus, said, come back. And there was just this sort of cottage cheese where this novella I had been working on, it was like this 40-page short story that was riddled with notes, and I was slowly expanding it, and all my thesis stuff was gone. And I kind of lost my mind and didn't come back.
Wow.
So.
Damn.
Yeah.
The school didn't give you any institutional support or recognition for what happened?
No, actually, they did not do anything to interpose between, and in fact, to the degree that I wonder if they had some interest in encouraging it. My three roommates and I were getting prisoners dilemmaed by state arson investigators who were threatening us with felony charges and saying, now I know your roommate Wade was getting high in there. And they were telling Wade, now I know your roommate Jeb was getting high in there, which was funny because I had a severe alcohol problem but didn't take other drugs. So it was fairly obvious that it was BS, but nobody was stepping in to protect us. And that was really unsettling because, here a year's worth of thesis work had to be redone.
Right.
And instead, like a couple times a week, these guys were stopping by and trying to be, trying to do their affable Lenny Briscoe thing. And it was shamefully transparent, just really charmless bastards.
What was the topic? Because that sounded like a good setup.
I was reevaluating the roles of British signals intelligence in World War II in the Battle of the Atlantic.
Nice.
Because the history of Enigma and the Ultra Secret was written by F.W. Winterbotham, who was I think he was a colonel in the RAF, who was essentially the supervisor of it. And the only other history of it was written by a guy named F.H. Hensley, who also was a member of Bletchley Park. So the only real histories we had were people going, this project helped win the war. Well, what did you do during the war? Well, I was on that project.
Right. So there's an untold story about the Enigma project.
I think it's been chipped away at a little bit. I mean, so this was sort of like the typical, I think, history student idea, which is like, there's not really a whole lot. You're not going to break news on this for the most part. So it was this historiographical cheat of like, I can go over this documentation and say, hey, these sources are nice, but they're not making allowances for these other factors like long-range bombers that could cross the Atlantic without refueling, a high-frequency direction finding, which could triangulate. You don't need to decrypt a sub-signal to know where it is. You don't need to know what it's saying to bomb it from a long-range bomber. And ultimately, like that and then much greater prevalence of convoy support ultimately eats away at the efficacy of the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic. That was my contention.
Nice. I think it was Steve Jacobson when he was making World War II historical analogies to the history of New College lately. So it's good to know that if we wanted to dip into that pool, that you're able to swim over there. We're going to go from World War II history into podcasts about the Hallmark Channel. Can you chart for us a little bit of that life course?
So I didn't really know what to do. I was lucky. I met a really wonderful woman at New College. We got married and she had health insurance. And so that enabled me to do some really dumb stuff for a while. I had a well-paying job as a legal videographer for a while. And that was neat because I actually just did all the reading I meant to get to at New College and didn't.
Yeah.
So you just sort of set the tape rolling and 75 minutes later, the tape is going to end and you'd have to say, like, we're going off the record. Keep going.
Not a lot of tight zooms for a reaction shot. You're just kind of plug and play.
Yeah. And well, you don't want to listen to it because you can't facially react to it because you're going to throw off somebody. This might be the only thing of their testimony that's offered during the trial. Like they're not actually going to make a physical appearance.
Oh, wow.
So we would have these guys who'd fly in, like a cranial surgery specialist from Seattle would fly in and then
it's like expert testimony type stuff. I was initially thinking you're recording the courtroom experience, but this is more like a private video testimony.
Yeah, it was usually people lying to the state. It was very depressing. It was a lot of people who were representatives of medical insurance companies lying very plainly. There was a guy who, when asked, I remember the attorney saying, now you wrote a master's thesis on blah, blah, blah. Is that correct? And then you watch the person and they take a deep breath because they're only able to be deposed for up to 8 hours per day.
Yeah.
So they go, what did I write my master's thesis on? Waste more time, repeat the question.
Yeah.
And then he says, I don't recall. So these people would just pretend not to know their own biography because it would waste
run
time.
out the
And
clock.
so you can't react to that. So it's better to let's read all of Livy for some reason. And don't read all of Livy, kids. Like, I think every classicist I know plays the same game. Like, what would we trade all of Livy for to get this one lost text back?
Right.
And don't do that. It's a waste of time. So I did those sorts of odd jobs, and I was at a party with an alumna pal and being irritating. And she said, why don't you take all of your goddamn opinions and just write them down somewhere? And I went, fair.
Yeah.
And I started a blog, and within about a year, maybe 18 months, I wrote a piece that went semi-viral. I think it had like 25,000 uniques.
Yeah.
And somebody from GQ reached out and said, have you considered freelancing?
Nice.
And so I did that, and parlayed that into writing for Gawker, did that for about a year, wrote for The Guardian, freelance. They took me on, so I was their U.S. politics columnist. And then after Matt Taibbi left Rolling Stone, before he went insane, he left to go to a publication funded by Pierre Omidyar, who is the guy who backs The Intercept. And that never got off the ground. But when he was gone, they needed a new national affairs correspondent. So I was briefly the national affairs correspondent at Rolling Stone for about 2 years.
Oh, that's longer than brief. That's not even faking it on a resume. That's good. Yeah.
It didn't feel like a long time. And in fact, like most of it was taken up by the 2016 campaign, which started in December of 2014.
Wow. That's an interesting stint. That's the subject of, I guess, another, or maybe we'll get into it, but that's quite a time to be working at a big paper, like a big, what do they call it? Magazine. It's called a magazine, like Rolling Stone.
Yeah, no, it was an incredible privilege, and it's great because when people say like, "Oh, you're a journalist, what do you do?" You're not saying like, "Oh, I write for this newspaper here." It's a name that people recognize, and even if you don't think that your output is that great, people generally esteem it. But the downside, to answer your question about the Hallmark thing, the downside is that it was a very public-facing gig, and I was on All In with Chris Hayes, I don't know, like 7 or 8 times, and then Don Trump Jr. followed.
Oh.
Because I used to ridicule Ted Cruz.
Okay.
And when he followed me, like over a 72-hour period, I think about 11,000 other accounts did. And so then anytime I said something nasty about our big, beautiful, wet president, I would get just a really creepy death threat. Usually along the lines of like, what can we infer about your background to make this threatening? So if somebody assumed I was Jewish, they'd threaten to put me in the oven. If they assumed I just liked black people, they'd threaten to hang me. If they assumed I was gay, they were like, we're going to drag you behind our truck and we're going to tie you to a fence post. And one of my best friends in journalism is now one of the editors at defector.com at the time. But he's Jewish, and he found out that he was living around the corner from the guy who did the Daily Shoah podcast. He was getting death threats constantly, and we said, let's do a podcast about something where nothing bad ever happens.
Okay.
And we've been doing it for like 7 years and 6 years, and we haven't gotten a single death threat. So that worked out.
And it's still active. The name of the podcast?
It's Christmastown.
It's Christmastown. There you go.
So, Jeb, why is it that these people are eating, a 3-foot pile of dinner rolls? Forget it, Jeb. It's Christmastown.
It's like Chinatown, but
there.
Christmas. I understand.
There is an internal logic there that is not available to you and me. So
yeah. And then still writing, I imagine. I saw you on Pablo Torre Finds Out relatively soon after the takeover happened, where, among other things, you were talking about New College. But you're still kind of like a public writer, journalist figure, and now you've crossed over a little bit into podcasting as a format that you're putting stuff out to the world. It's a confusing time, I guess. If people want to find you, where should they go?
Probably the easiest thing to do is go to Blue Sky and search for my name, although my actual @name is Mobute, Mobute, harking back to a thing a fellow New College alumni did when at the school we had some zines for 2 years where when we had extra space to fill, instead of just cutting 2 pages, because when you made a zine, you had to do in multiples of 4. So if we had 14 pages, we would just write 2 more as opposed to cutting 2. We should have cut 2. But when we'd write 2 more, we came up with this concept that former notorious African dictator Mobutu Sese Seko had been a New College student.
Okay.
And ostensibly, because he had to come to the West to learn imperialism and plunder.
Yeah.
And so that was when I started blogging. I had actually been stalked and harassed pretty badly on the internet. I had been doxxed. People called my house and threatened my ex and me. Yeah. And I figured, well, if I blog under the name Mobutu Sese Seko, the SEO will never, ever track anybody back, because all the hits for Mobutu are going to be for the kleptocrat guy. Sure. And that worked out.
Beautiful chapeaus. And turns out kleptocracy's back in. So you were ahead of the curve on that front. So the hostile takeover happens. That's been sort of a flashbulb moment in a lot of the interviews that we have. Like, where were you? How did you find out about it? And then how has it unfolded for you since then? What's your take? You were someone who got pulled into the conversation to kind of represent for New College.
Yeah, I don't think anybody really I should be clear and say, like, nobody was like, we need him. it was he's the guy who knows some people. I can definitely think of some fellow journalists from New College who I think would have, from a professional cred standpoint, represented more rigorous reporting that we could have used. But I saw it on Facebook. My friend Shannon Ingalls, who you've had on the podcast, lives 45 minutes from me. So she texted me, did you see this? Oh, we have to do something to fight back. And I just sort of kept my eye on the alumni group on Facebook. I got added to the Slack. And then when things would come up and people would say, what do we do about this? I'd say, okay, here's some people you can contact. This is the easiest way to get some attention. Make this easy for somebody reporting on this. Spoon feed it to them. Because, if they don't have to track anything down, they're likelier to do it if they know all the information already that you provided them. So I was doing that kind of tips and tricks sort of thing. And then, I like being paid for stuff. So when something came up that I could write about, I did. So I think the first sort of noteworthy thing I'd written, I don't think it was a particularly big outlet. I'd written somewhere else, but I wrote something for The Nation on the secret graduation ceremony, the second year. And that was something that Shannon had told me was invite only. I didn't think I was going to go. And then somebody said, we really need coverage for this. Can we get somebody this year? We had good representation last year. And I had a friend in town actually visiting who worked at Rolling Stone and MSNBC like I did, just not at the same time. She was the former politics editor at Glamour. And I said, would you mind coming down to Sarasota? We can get into a very beautiful, very, very exclusive party. It's going to be at a lovely location. It looks like the Super Friends Hall of Justice. And you can watch my kid while I'm there because I'm going to be working. And she was a real trooper. She was very nice. She entertained my son and then also talked to people and got some color and notes for me. And I came home and crashed, woke up and filed it for The Nation. And then I think that kind of made people inclined to keep talking to me. I don't know if that preceded the Pablo Torre thing. I think it did.
Probably. But also, we're doing something extemporaneous now. You also seem like someone people could put in front of a microphone to just talk about what's going on. Nothing against the Hallmark Channel, but the fact that you're able to fill as much time as you can talking about the Hallmark Channel, almost as like a ad absurdum kind of content domain, then bringing it to something that's more culturally hot and something you have specific experiences with. I want to thank you for your service, I guess is what I'm saying, because I feel like you're putting forth a more authentic and kind of entertaining, interesting take where I think there's a risk, that stuff starts to feel almost knee-jerk and kind of formulaic. You don't strike me as bringing that kind of heat. I think you bring your own energy, and you're still in Florida, right?
Yeah, so it was very easy. I mean, in fact, this is one of the ways that I've gotten a lot of freelance assignments over the years is so much of journalism is still a New York-based concern. When it ventures out of New York, it usually only goes as far as the Acela runs to D.C. Yeah. So when there's a story in Florida, they look around like, who do we know in Florida? My stiffest competition was Adam Weinstein, formerly of Mother Jones. I think he was at New Republic for a while. But he finally moved to upstate New York because he got a job on Chris Hayes' show as a producer. So that freed things up for me. But, it came down to who do we know that we can send there? Who's within a 4-hour drive or less from this event. And so I knew Pablo because he liked a lot of podcast guest stints I'd done on one that a friend of mine did who actually was never a New College student, but played in bands at New College. I did not know him at New College at all. I actually met him on the internet, and he was mouthing off about Manatee County or something. I was like, how do you know about Manatee?
Yeah.
And it was a sort of fun small world thing. But, in this case, like Pablo knew me from that. And then his producer, Matt Sullivan, was one of my editors when I was at The Guardian. And so when they needed somebody to actually shepherd them through without being inaccurate, I was the first name that came to mind. Because like so much of, when you read like the New York Times covering something in, Wichita Falls, they don't have a person there. They just sort of parachute in somebody from the home office to figure it out in a day. Yeah. And, you can definitely see it. If you're from that area, you can see like, oh, the first person they talked to was this kind of idiot. And so that's why they had this guided tour through all the worst ideas about this area, because their Tenzing Norgay was just some asshole. So
Pick your Sherpers wisely is the takeaway that I'm getting there. But then, you've been in Florida, you were writing pieces for, big publications, you're on podcasts. Like, there was an initial kind of flurry of activity back in 2023, but then since then, things kind of petered out in different fronts. We also have been talking about really since then that there were the existing students who were sort of, the rug was pulled out from under them a bit by the changes above them. They're now mostly passing through, and now the college is going to be really constituted of the new admissions policies, the baseball, which is something we want to get into because I know you talked about that as well. How have you stayed connected to it, and how do you think about kind of telling the story now that we're 2+ years in? It's going to be graduation again this year. The energy is probably not the heated level that it was maybe 2 years ago.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, the very name news, right, sort of bespeaks that it has a recency bias. Yeah. And this is one of the toughest things. If you care at all, if you have any kind of social justice or activist bent to your journalism, the really hard thing to do to get past an editor is this is a problem that you've reported on, and it still is. Yeah. Which you would think the fact that the problem persists would bespeak a certain crisis to it, or a greater or, sort of persevering injustice that warrants greater engagement. But people don't want to read about the same problem that only has a certain modification. Right. It's the same reason why we could be in Afghanistan for a generation and pretty much all people remember is like, we got there, right. Stanley McChrystal, something about Hamid Karzai, we got out, horse soldiers, right? That's it. And so I think you're going to get a little brief kind of re-efflorescence of attention to it with the graduation, because that's a great news peg. Okay, what happens now? We've washed through this population. We've sort of turned it over. I think you're also going to see, as DeSantis is out the door, this is going to be part of his legacy. So you're going to see a reckoning with what it means. But the other difficulty is it's really difficult to write speculative pieces. Editors don't want you to run well, here are the 4 things that can happen, and we don't know which of them is likelier. Right. Especially because those 4 may not be the totality of what can happen. We're always surprised by current events. And if you devote all this print real estate or even costlier television real estate to this thing that may happen, and then you've got something else entirely, at this point, you've just looked foolish. Wait until it happens, right, and then report on it the next day.
I think Megan was the first one who mentioned this to me, and it stuck with me, is New College was more of a story prior to the election last November and prior to like what we've been seeing in higher ed this year. We almost called this podcast The Canary in the Swamp to talk about how New College was kind of a canary who might be sniffing some fumes and may not be long for this world. And in some ways that might be reflective of the broader context. I'm kind of glad we didn't choose that name, but it also seems like it was probably on the money in some ways. How do you think about now? How do you think about now moving forward? If there are other alums listening to this who maybe haven't heard from you before, do you have any message for folks who care about New College, who went there and have been kind of struggling over the last couple of years?
Well, I think, it's a message really similar to what people are hearing about sort of resistance to the Trump administration. A lot of the people that you think are in power don't really hear from people. If a newsroom hears from 50 people saying that you have failed to cover this, they'll probably cover that if it's a real thing. Like, because obviously newsrooms are hearing all the time about like, you're not covering chemtrails, and right. Like, okay. Right. But if it's a concrete thing, if you can provide them with some evidentiary basis for writing about this, prove that it's not just a demon living in your head, right? It's really easy to get that attention. And the same goes through for public representatives. Your state representatives are not used to hearing from a lot of people. If they get 20 letters about something, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
So if you can persuade anybody to write in and, give them as much information as possible, it can scare them a little bit. And I think there is a good opportunity here with the investigation into DeSantis, his wife, Uthmeyer, over Hope, Florida. The trouble with Florida representatives is, Florida usually winds up in the top 5 in most corrupt states. It's like Florida and New Jersey and, a few others. But we don't really think of it as a corrupt state. And what's kind of breathtaking about this is you have Republicans who are making a big deal about investigating corruption, which is not something you would expect from a party that has a hammerlock on the legislature, via gerrymandering. They do not want to set a precedent of accountability, but DeSantis has burned so many bridges and alienated so many people,
Right.
and there's so many people willing to dance on his grave that if you can give them sort of, more dirt to put on top of it, I think they will take the opportunity. So, don't sell short your ability to move some units with a state representative by getting just a few people together and say, why are you not talking about this? If Hope Florida is a pressing issue, the fact that, we are spending $50 million above the normal annual budget to fail is kind of a big deal, because at this point, what they've produced seems to be like a real estate grab at most. And that is a very, very easy, corrupt story to tell. I mean, and the fact that you have, Corcoran and his media representative waving his piccolo at, poor women at Dillard's.
Right.
And the Sarasota sheriff didn't bother even actually arresting this guy so it wouldn't show up in a records search. And it turns out that the guy in question's dad is the CEO of the international airport. There's so much coziness right there. And if this is DeSantis's handpicked guy, well, let's kick his ass on the way out the door too.
It almost reminds me of someone I saw on Facebook the other day was trying to get rid of a wasp, and they kind of like didn't want to knock the nest because that's like a dumb thing to do. And it does almost seem like the type of people who write letters and, the number of letters to the editor that New College alums have written, like the level of like ongoing steady activity that we've seen over the last 2.5 years is somewhat inspiring. It does seem like, like even at the time we were saying we're probably not going to win, but if we make them uncomfortable, it's like a shot across the bow, rather than caving. So my assessment there is at least, the Pyrrhic victory, you're a classicist, so you could probably quote more about Pyrrhus and other things, but just from like a game theory, wargaming kind of, we're talking about scenarios. How have things played out? Unlike other places where the editors may hold you back, we might goad you on in terms of some of the scenarios you want to put out there. Where do you see stuff heading, and how do you think we've done so far?
Happy to answer that, obviously. But just let me append another thing, which is, there a lot of publications nationwide don't think of Florida except as news of the weird.
Yeah.
And so they'll write breathlessly about the crisis of legitimacy on campuses at places, in the sort of that Acela corridor. So another thing that can work is, it's great to get things in the Sarasota Herald Tribune. It's great to get things in the Tampa Bay Times. But if you see an article about what is going to happen to this campus as it's being taken over by, let's say, elements sympathetic to the Trump administration, if you can send, 5 people send something to that editor saying, if you want to see what happens to the Canary after, 400 cubic feet of carbon monoxide, have I got the college for you? As for like how I saw it playing out, I mean, this is more or less it. I mean, the Florida Republican Party has governed with more or less impunity for a generation now, thanks to gerrymandering, and never really being stopped and never really being called to account for more than a 3-day news cycle. It's not something that really lingers in the imagination. And it seemed to me to be something that was going to be done primarily to secure real estate, and also because if they build something, great. If they made their Hillsdale, great. But I think they all would have been satisfied knowing that they had destroyed the woke bot factory, and they did.
Yeah.
So I think, if you're trying to game where it goes next, I think the thing to do is talk to people who are very good at property law and who can see where the New College properties and where their potential uses are in the future, because there are certain parts of the campus that I'm sure have restrictions on what they can be converted to.
Yeah.
Because I think, unless they win like a NIA championship, there's not really a push to maintain this. Because again, this is DeSantis's experiment. It's wildly over budget, even by their lights, and especially after decades of wanting to be as parsimonious as possible with New College. I can't imagine anybody wants to continue that expenditure. If you destroyed the Wokebot factory, that's great. We can walk away from that and feel we won, and then maybe use this to develop some kind of center that we can rent out for performances or something.
You mentioned the NAIA. I know you've been tracking the sports scene down there. I was a pretty sportsy New College kid when I was there, and I still track it. You were pretty close to what was going on around the baseball team. We haven't talked a lot of sports on the pod, so it might be a good place to get a little bit of your perspective there.
I mean, it starts out as a joke. That's where it ends. I mean, we can do a whole paragraph of like, let's have a reasonable discussion about what this means. Like, sure, okay. Maybe New College is doing a little bit of arbitrage and going to these private Christian academies to find overlooked ball players. And maybe they're providing an opportunity to them to advance to a 4-year school. But why is that New College's mission? Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, we have the largest baseball team in the country.
Right.
Like,
you could field 2 teams.
I think 3 probably. But I mean, does that translate to New College being a baseball powerhouse? If it did, would it be worth it? Probably not, but it hasn't. Mm-hmm. So at this point, it kind of, you can start with that punchline. We have the largest baseball team in the country, but we just kind of wind up back there. And then, what is the purpose of that? Now we can have a lot of ancillary conversations about what has that done to, campus culture and student life? Does that make certain students feel unsafe? But then we're also just kind of doing that year end at the graduation. Like, how much have we sort of purged this woke element? How many people are left to be harassed? Do they find it, a problem that this sort of campus culture element is there? Mm-hmm. Or are the people who are there now so acclimated to it that it doesn't seem aberrant or intrusive?
I was going to ask if anyone from the administration has gotten in touch with you, or I don't know, maybe you can't talk about this, but you've been down there, you've been at some of these events. I was wondering, has anybody from the administration, speaking of being harassed or targeted, reached out to you and tried to influence your stories or kill them?
No, I mean, they've mainly just ignored them. We sent emails to everybody we wanted to talk to, that we could talk to, that could make the story better. Anytime I've had a question, whose answer could actually improve something I was writing, I've sent something and just not gotten any comment, because I think it's easy to write me off. You can Google, you can see what I've written about it. Oh, he's an alum, forget about it.
It might have been a sale at Dillard's at that time.
The Pablo Torre finds out piece, who we got to show up on camera was who spoke. Mm-hmm. And what we were able to ultimately run on video was much less than was initially said. Mm-hmm. So we did preliminary phone conversations. We got more commitments in terms of these people willing to pledge that we're doing this, we're doing that. But then when it actually came time to sit down, suddenly they either couldn't comment on it, or were just saying next question, or straight up denying that was something on their radar, when we knew from previous conversations that it was, which, is to be expected. But no, there does not seem to be a sinister attempt to squelch or suppress people commenting on it. I think because, it's more or less happened with impunity. Why bother? Right. With the same sense of the cover up is worse than the crime. Mm-hmm. If you are actively interfering in journalism and trying to get things not printed, that is enough of a news peg to make a story that is already old news and is continuing to die on the vine. That's enough to revivify it. So don't do it.
Also, that would assume a level of competence that may not be there, as evidenced by some of the hires and some of the approaches that they've taken to communication and AV, the audio feedback, which was kind of legendary.
Joe Ricketts from Chicago. Yeah.
So who knows? We're mentioning Chicago. Is any hot takes on the new Pope?
Social media is so good for some things, and just seeing the sheer number of people making claims that the Pope, listen, the only deep dish he's going to eat is Pequods, right? Anything less, or that's great. Seeing people preemptively mad, I just know he's going to be a Cubs fan, and the pure elation that he was a White Sox fan.
His brother has corroborated this. I'm a Knicks fan too, so the Nova thing, he's got to be pulling for Brunson and the Nova boys, I would assume. That's the sports we need to get. Grant, did you have questions? Do you have things you want to get in?
I have a twofold question.
Sure.
There's 2 sets of answers. We're both parents of Florida kids. My daughter's just graduated FSU. I got a kid who almost went to New College and wound up going to the Air Force Academy. And I'm also kind of mentoring students who are still at New College. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's hope for the future? That's question 1. And question 2, which is related to that maybe, is have you been paying attention to what's going on at University of West Florida, where they tried this takeover and it failed miserably?
I did see that. I enjoyed the fact that it was ultimately Don Gates that shut that down. I knew Don when he was running for superintendent of schools in Okaloosa
wow.
County. I was on the newspaper staff. It was very fun because he had sent baby Gates off to some Florida private princeling academy, and he had to bring him back and enroll him at the local middle school named after a famous local John Bircher. Because if his son wasn't in the county schools, then what would it say about his commitment to actually running them? But Don, you know, when he began, he was very much in the kind of George H.W. Bush mold. And I got to watch him over the course of the Gingrich Revolution and the sort of Rush hegemony in the conservative, you know, think, speak space take over. I watched him have to ape that with real discomfort. And I think he was relatively comfortable with the Bush revolution. Obviously, he was a good friend of Jeb's. False Jeb, by the way. I just want to put that out there every time.
Oh,
His name
right.
is John
Oh, my
Ellis
God.
Bush.
I hadn't thought the whole Florida Jeb thing. I didn't think about that until now.
Just carpetbagging bullshit right there. False Jeb.
Yeah.
And we repudiate him. But yeah, no, like it's been palpable, his sense of discomfort with the Trump revolution, and seeing him sort of retreat to Northwest Florida as his son is just a colossal embarrassment. You know, Don did a lot to nurture ties in Okaloosa County, and even the solidly red Okaloosa County Commission wants nothing to do with Matt, which is why Matt made his headquarters in Pensacola and did most of his campaigning and appearances there. So that was great to just see Don just go, you know what, this guy is a complete shit for brains, absolutely not, and vote against it. But I hadn't seen a whole lot more about that. As for hope for the future, I mean, you know what, I was a history student and then I got into journalism, so that's pretty much bred out of you real fast. You know, it's funny. I was joking with a friend. I took my son to one of the protests recently before May Day, and somebody said, "Do you feel safe having him out there?" And I said, "Well, I send him to public school every day in America. What do you think?" Right? Like he's already doing the riskiest thing I could make him do.
So where do you think he's going to go to college?
Out of state. No, I mean, I'd be fine. Like, you know, there is an inertia to places like UF and FSU that at New College just doesn't have. And we haven't seen a total transformation there. I mean, they put Joseph Latipo on faculty there, and you had Ben Sass just sort of feathering his underlings' nests. But on the whole, it's, you know, there was an article by a religion professor in the New York Times, an op-ed about how stigmatized she feels about bringing up certain keywords, and how they have, you know, clearly these sorts of like Ben Shapiro and Daily Caller inspired guys who are going in and pretending to be students and trying to rat fuck these teachers with false complaints. And I know that has, you know, an enormously chilling effect, but that kind of sustained assault peters out if it doesn't keep getting wins, and it hasn't. I think the trustees for UF are not interested in this. And I think that we're seeing this on a micro level from parents around the country, just the round defeats that are being handed to the, you know, moms of liberty or whatever. When you have people encountering these people at the county level, and they can see these people are assholes and they're stupid assholes and they don't want them in charge. Like, you know, my kid's going to elementary school. This isn't your, you know, Skinner box to play with. I don't care what kind of experiment you want to run. And I think that's ultimately going to filter up, especially as you see this happening in high schools, and you have parents going, okay, well, I've just saved up 6 figures to send a kid to a state school that when I was a kid, you could go to for under 10 grand for 4 whole years. I don't want you fucking around with that crippling investment of mine. And so that, I think that reality is going to be brought home before a lot of these victories can set in, because they haven't, you know, they really haven't minted much. You know, DeSantis puts Ben Sass in there. What did that do? You know, I mean, nobody's walking around going like, we got Ben Sass. Like, this is not something that you shout at your ideological opponents on the street. 1, would they even know? 2, if they do, are they going to care? Like, it's Ben Sass. You know, he's a wet noodle.
And it ended badly. When I think about Corcoran as a corollary to what happened with Sass, you know, it does seem like the facade is kind of crumbling a little bit, certainly around DeSantis, but then by extension, you know, the takeover at New College. I think the problem is more like how much real damage has been done to the school, which is kind of like, you know, sadly, maybe a corollary to the Trump administration, like gutting the institutions that many of us value in our culture. So anyway, on an up note here, Jeb, we kind of want to wrap things up here. Any concluding thoughts, any takeaways?
Just if you were somebody who heard me make a comment about thinking back to my new college experience and wanting to apologize, yes, you're 100% correct. And I am sorry.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I don't have much else. Listen to It's Christmastown. You don't have to watch any of the movies to enjoy it. The movies aren't meant to be watched anyway. They're meant to be on while you fold laundry. So if you want to listen to very smart people overthinking something that's very stupid in a way that's never going to make you particularly angry or ruin your day, it's a great podcast for that. I would love to be doing that instead of what I am doing, which is, still freelancing and holding on, but also I'm proofing resumes for a medical group in Maine. I'm doing comms stuff when I can. I mean, I bring this up anytime, people want to talk about journalism. There's a great graph you can see over the last 20 years, and it's two lines going in opposite directions. Over 20 years, you've got anywhere from, depending on how it's calculated, about 300 to 800,000 jobs vanishing from journalism. But what gets created? 300 to 800,000 PR jobs.
I was also thinking social media influencers is the other. Well, you're kind of leaning in a little bit there too, which is good on you. I'm
not, I'm good with concealer. I'm not that good with liquid eyeliner. I just don't think I have the mask for it. But yeah, no, I mean, support whatever journalism you can. If you have money for a subscription for an independent journalist who's going to work their ass off to break the sorts of stories that, the sclerotic New York Times is not going to, please do that. And if you know of any copywriting or content writing gigs, get in touch with me through the podcast. Thank you.
Amazing stuff. Jeb, thank you so much for joining us on today's show.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks always, Grant, Megan. We'll be back again soon. This is the Popcorn Podcast.